All right, I'm going to try something a little different today, and I'm going to give you the first installment of a series on collective violence in American history. And this series is based on the notes for a class I'm currently teaching at West Virginia University. This is my first time teaching this class, so things might be a little bit raw. And going forward, I might go back and make a more polished and rehearsed version of these notes, but we're just going to go ahead and dive in and see what we come up with. Now, going forward here, I'm going to try to maintain something like my normal speaking pattern and not accidentally slip into the verbal cadence of Dan Carlin on Hardcore History, though he is one of my podcast influences, and you might hear some of that cropping up. So let me explain in this very first installment some of the broad theoretical background to the study of collective violence. Now, this series won't primarily be a big picture theory-oriented series. I'm not going to talk a ton about sociology like I normally do, but I do think it's good to have a handle on some basic patterns and concepts that we can apply to these individual cases and incidents in American history. And one of the first places to start with this is with the idea that most collective violence is rooted in human conflict. Now, not all of it. Some of the violence carried out by groups is purely predatory. A gang of robbers just aims to get money and might pick victims just out of pure convenience. And some violence is more a matter of ritual. There are things like fraternity hazings and gang initiation rituals. And some violence is purely recreational. People will mosh and brawl and box and smash up things just for fun. If you might recall, if you're old enough to remember the 90s, there was a period of time when Chicago Bulls fans would smash up Chicago if their team lost and they were angry, but also if their team won and they were joyous. But at the core of most severe collective violence in American history, there's usually a conflict. It's a grievance. Someone thinks someone else has done something inappropriate, crazy, evil, unjust, or otherwise offensive. Conflict in this sense is everywhere. Most conflicts are small and quickly forgotten, but I doubt anybody listening has this week gone without giving or taking offense at something. It's part of the friction of human interaction. It's part of our nature that we rub each other the wrong way from time to time. Just like it's part of our nature that we pass judgment on one another's actions. Heck, we even judge ourselves. Have you ever gotten mad at yourself for screwing up and thought, oh, I was so stupid? Or have you ever felt guilty for something you did or failed to do? Well, congratulations. You just had a conflict with yourself. Now, this definition of conflict I've been laying out comes from sociologist Donald Black. He is a theoretical sociologist who has been very influential in the study of conflict. And he observes that when conflict erupts, people can handle it in all kinds of different ways. A lot are minor. We might roll our eyes when someone says something offensive. We might give a dirty look. We might find an excuse to end the conversation. You know, I got laundry in the dryer at home. I got to get going. We might just decide not to invite Crazy Joe to the party ever again. Sometimes we demand compensation for a wrong. You hit my car, you better pay me back for the cost of repairing it. Sometimes we demand punishment. The criminal needs to go to jail, or that misbehaving child should be spanked. The catch-all term for how people handle conflict is social control. This is a definition I'm taking from Donald Black. Social control is any way of defining and responding to deviant behavior. Now, of course, like a lot of other terms in the fragmented and chaotic field of sociology, this term has other meanings. There's an older meaning that some people still use, which is to refer to anything that makes people conform to social norms and rules. That's not the meaning I'm using here, though, because you had a younger generation at that time who looked at the various ways people punish or otherwise handle deviance, and one of the things they realized was that it might actually be counterproductive. This might actually be increasing deviance, such as when sending somebody to prison further cements them into a criminal lifestyle. There was also the realization that deviance is in the eye of the beholder, even within a society where there's some broad agreement on social norms. You will find people applying the deviant label very differently. One person's action is a criminal theft. Another person's action is an unfortunate symptom of their kleptomania. And yet another person's is an understandable rebellion against the capitalist system that oppressed them. So social control means defining and responding to deviant behavior. And deviant here is in the eye of the beholder. Pretty much anything you can think of, any behavior you can think of has, in the grand scheme of human culture and history, been called wrong in some time and place or another. So social control in this sense is pretty much synonymous with having and handling a conflict, which means it's a very big category that includes all kinds of reactions, big and small. But we can divide this up into a few major forms and styles. A style of social control, as Donald Black defines it, is how the deviance is understood. Is it a crime that deserves punishment, an injury that deserves compensation, a disorder that deserves therapy? Major forms of social control include avoidance, settlement, and aggression. Avoidance is a way of handling deviance by reducing contact. It could be limited and temporary, like when an angry friend or boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't talk to you for a day or two. Or it could be something permanent, like when that angry boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you and doesn't want to see you ever again. It can be something voluntary, I quit, or something coercive, you're fired. Settlement is another form, and this is when people handle their problems by taking them before some mostly neutral third party that they hope will listen to and resolve the case. Now, this could be as simple as kids complaining to their parent, Johnny hit me, or it could be employees complaining to the boss or to the human resources department, or something a bit more severe and formalistic, like calling the police and taking a case to court through lawsuits. Aggression is when people act unilaterally with confrontation or even violence. Some of the older readings on this subject, including readings by Donald Black, will use the term self-help. And it's a bit confusing for a lot of modern readers or listeners because we think of self-help as that section at the bookstore that teaches you how to win friends and influence people or feel better about yourself or get promotions at work. But the older sense of self-help in the sociology of conflict is thinking with comparison to relying on law. Instead of filing a suit or calling the cops, you take the law into your own hands. You decide how that offender should be punished or otherwise dealt with. And so self-help in the sociology of conflict includes things like vengeance killings or lynch mobs. So a lot of violence in human society is self-help. Another way to say this is that a lot of violence in human history is moralistic. The target of the violence is being treated as an enemy or as a wrongdoer, someone who deserves punishment. We might say that all violent social control is moralistic in nature. It enforces some moral judgment. Moralistic violence includes legal execution as well as private vengeance, as well as execution by lynch mobs or having your home smashed up and burned by angry rioters. Most collective violence is moralistic in this sense. The perpetrators see the targets as wrongdoers. Saying the violence is moralistic is more or less the same thing as saying the violence is a form of social control, which is more or less the same thing as saying it is caused by human conflict. Our first question then becomes, what makes violent social control more likely? Donald Black claims that one broad pattern is that moralism is greater, more extreme, more one-sided, more coercive, more punitive across longer social distances. That is, the greater the distance between the two parties in the conflict, the more that they're unrelated to one another, the more that they're from separate cultures and communities, the more extreme their social control is likely to be, the more harshly moralistic and violent it is likely to be. Another idea is that it grows more extreme, more harsh, more severe with the social inferiority of the target. Violence towards a social superior is comparatively less likely than violence towards a social inferior. Punishment of superiors tends to be less severe on the grand scale of things than punishment of equals than punishment of inferiors. You see this pattern play out in things like the degree of tolerance that slaves throughout history have had for punishment and abuse from their masters. It might not be subjective tolerance, but looking across the broad span of history, slave rebellions, while they're a regular feature, are not nearly as common as slave punishments. And the common reaction for the typical slave is to endure the punishments of their masters. The masters, on the other hand, may be extremely brutal in their punishments of the slaves. If you want to see some very extreme examples, look not just to the American South, but to slavery in the ancient world, where the supply of slaves was ongoing, meaning each individual slave was much less valuable. The Romans would do crazy things like feed a slave to lampreys, throw them down into a pit of carnivorous fish because they had broken a dish at dinner. So this is Black's theory of moralism. Moralism is a direct function of social distance and social superiority. Now, sociology obviously isn't a hard science like physics. We're not dealing here with mathematical precision. And of course, any statement of tendency we make, you can immediately think of several counterexamples or exceptions. But it's worth noting that the style of theory here, the style of explanation, is something similar to the theories in physics, where you explain things by identifying general relationships between very basic features of the universe. Why is a person lighter on the moon than they are on Earth? Because gravity is the product of mass, and the mass of the moon is much less than the mass of the Earth. Therefore, there's less force of gravity on the moon. Therefore, the person weighs lighter on a scale and can jump higher. Using that same style of explanation, we might ask why someone stealing from his own kin is less likely to be lynched than someone stealing from a different community. It's because moralism is greater with social distance, and there's more social distance when someone steals from a different community. The lynching is an example of greater moralism than some lesser reaction. It's harsher, it's more punitive than, say, just giving the person a talking to and telling him to give it back, which is the sort of social control you might find more often among relative intimates. But let's back up and talk a little bit about what social distance and social superiority mean. So there's several different kinds of social distance. These are defined by Black and often used by those who follow his line of theory. One kind of social distance is what he calls relational distance. This is another word for intimacy or lack thereof. And it's how much people participate in one another's lives. On the individual level, you can measure this with things like how much time they spend together, or how long they've known each other, or how many facets of their life they share together. On the group level, you can measure with things like how often members of the two groups interact, how many close relationships cross group lines, whether people from the group ever intermarry and what the rate of intermarriage is. Another kind of social distance is cultural distance. This is how similar or different people are in terms of their culture, their symbolic aspect of life, including things like their language, their religious beliefs, their clothing styles, their customs, and all of that. And again, we can think of this whether the parties to the conflict are individuals or groups. Two denominations of Christians are culturally closer to one another than either would be to a Hindu or a Muslim, or to someone holding various animist beliefs that a lot of native peoples have had around the world. Finally, there's interdependence versus independence. People who are interdependent are socially closer than those who do not depend on one another. You can measure this with how much people cooperate and rely on one another for their well-being and survival, economically or otherwise. Is there a division of labor between them? You and I might hardly know one another, so in that sense we're distant, but if I need you to supply the product for my business, well, there's sort of a bond between us that's different from other people I might hardly know. Now, generally speaking, all three of these things, relational and cultural distance and independence, have similar effects on social control. That is the justification for lumping them all together as a kind of social distance. All else equal, including the nature of the alleged offense, reactions are more likely to be severe when social distance is greater. This means that moralistic violence is more likely when relational distance, cultural distance, and functional independence are greater. This means you're more likely to see things like killing, sadistic torturing, and large-scale slaughter when all these things are greater. Another variable we talk about here is inequality of status. Now, what is social status? Broadly speaking, it's someone's position in the distribution of social resources, their place in the great human pile. The most obvious and easily quantifiable kind of status is wealth. But there's other ways that people sort themselves out in the great human pile. There's rank in terms of giving and taking orders in a hierarchy of authority. The police officer who pulls me over might make less than me in yearly salary, but during the course of his duties, he outranks me. I have to take his orders upon pain of imprisonment. Another kind of social status we might call reputation or respectability. And that's depending on your reputation for being deviant or virtuous, however those things are understood within the context. So the notorious gangster might be cash wealthy, but he is notorious. He is a gangster. People in respectable society look down on him for that, will be less inclined to trust him, and might be more inclined to punish him if he's accused of something. Another form of status is organization. A group is more powerful than an individual. A bigger group is more powerful than a smaller one. They have a greater capacity for collective action, as Black puts it. Likewise, a group with some sort of division of labor, with specialized roles, with a central leadership to coordinate things, is more organized, has a greater capacity than one that's just a sort of disorderly mob or rabble. So we can think of organization as being another type of social status, resulting in relations of superiority and inferiority. So the general prediction here from Donald Black is that moralism is greater in downward directions and becomes harsher and more severe as that vertical distance, that gap in status, grows. You can see extremes in societies with very big gulfs of status, like you find in a lot of ancient civilizations and medieval kingdoms, where there's a very firm class or caste system, a big gap that separates the slaves and the peasants from the aristocrats and the citizens. You'll see extremes of punishment in cases where the former, the low-ranking, offends the latter, the high-ranking. Treason against the central authority gets punished even more harshly. Ancient empires like the Assyrians were proud of how cruelly they would punish distant subordinates. If the tribes in the mountains rebelled, as mountaineers everywhere are prone to do, they would skin them alive and do other nasty things. While violent social control is generally greater in downward directions, let's not forget that you also can get some nasty violence in upward directions as well. Sometimes the slaves do rebel. People with grievances against a powerful nation might turn to terrorism, carrying out mass killings of the civilians under the rule of that government with bombing or shooting attacks. A high degree of inequality might make this thing generally less likely to happen, but more severe when it does happen. You see extremes of rebellion in the same social conditions that create extremes of discipline. So where slaves are wantonly punished, sometimes cruelly punished, executed, mutilated, and other horrible things for minor offenses, you will also occasionally get slave rebellions that are, in their own right, cruel. We tend to sympathize more with the slaves nowadays because they are the underdog and we know slavery is evil. But when you read some of these accounts, you'll see whole families murdered, infants slaughtered in the crib, and other sorts of unrestrained violence. That polarized nature of the conflict, that high degree of social distance and inequality, leads to both the extreme downward and upward violence. So let's apply these ideas to collective violence, specifically. Being highly moralistic, a severe and hostile form of social control, it is more likely across larger social distances. Collective violence in general increases with relational and cultural distance and with functional independence. And this applies to different forms and patterns of it. But what are the different forms and patterns of collective violence? Historian and sociologist Roberta Senechal de la Roche defines 4 major kinds of collective violence. This is not an exhaustive classification. It focuses on unilateral, one-sided violence and doesn't really get into things like feuding and raiding between groups, which is more of a reciprocal or bilateral form of violence. But these are a good 4 forms to start with and cover a lot of the collective violence we'll see in American history. These forms of violence, defined by Roberta Senechal de la Roche, she defines them by their degree of organization and by the kind of liability they employ. Well, what is liability? Liability here means who is held accountable for some alleged wrongdoing. Now, we might take it for granted that, of course, the person who did the wrong is the one who gets punished, but that's not always the case. If a member of Family A kills a member of Family B might take vengeance by killing the first member of Family A they can find, regardless of whether or not he was the original murderer. And one thing we see in a lot of ethnic and racial conflict is that people will hold the entire social category, the entire group, responsible for a bad thing that one or a few of them have supposedly done. In fact, when you boil it down, a lot of what we call racism or prejudice is basically conflict where people target their grievances against the whole social category rather than against individual offenders. Sometimes this results in indiscriminate violence against anyone from the enemy group. That's called collective liability. Collective liability is where people are subjected to social control, including moralistic violence, just because of their social category, regardless of their individual conduct. And this applies, be that category a family, a race, a religion, a nationality, or whatever. On the other hand, you have individual liability, where people are punished because of something they supposedly have done. The accusation might not be accurate, but it is levied at a particular person, and that particular person is punished because of that accusation. Other people who might share their family or race or religion are spared. Collective violence also varies in how organized it is. I guess you could say that any group is more organized than any individual, and this is a form of advantage groups have against individuals. This is what makes a mob so scary when it comes after you. But there's degrees of organization, as we mentioned before. You can have a fairly spontaneous mob with no formal leadership or division of labor, and at the other end, you could have a standing group with a membership role and officers and executives and a formal division of labor. That is a much more organized group. So going by Roberta Senechal de la Roche's definitions, which are as good as any other, lynching is a form of violence that has low organization and individual liability. In lynching, a relatively spontaneous and fleeting mob comes together to punish one or a few individuals for something they've supposedly done. Rioting has low organization and collective liability. Here again, it's a relatively spontaneous and fleeting mob coming together, but now they're attacking a whole group or community with little regard to what individuals have done. Random blacks or whites or Chinese or Catholics or Jews get beaten or shot on sight. Whole neighborhoods might get smashed up and burned. Vigilantism, on the other hand, has high organization, but individual liability. The vigilante group has a fairly defined membership, sometimes formal leadership, and can persist for months or years. But they mostly attack individuals accused of particular offenses. Now, granted, this might be in the service of some larger collective conflict, like a major concern of the Ku Klux Klan was keeping black folks in their place as they saw it. But they did it mostly by attacking particular individuals they judged to be troublemakers or agitators for civil rights. And they would even hold these private trials where they discussed the reasons to target a person and pass sentence on him. Other vigilante groups just focused on other kinds of deviance like theft or murder. And even the Klan, which is mostly remembered nowadays for their anti-black violence, but they punished people for offenses unrelated to race conflict, offenses against the general morals like drunkenness or incest. Finally, terrorism, Roberta Senechal de la Roche defines as violence that is fairly well organized and has collective liability. The terrorist group, much like the vigilante group, might persist for years, maybe even decades, and has a clear membership, leadership, and maybe an extensive division of labor. Their main mode of attack, though, is targeting members of the enemy group as a whole, or at least those members of the enemy group they can easily access, such as blowing up plane loads or building loads or train loads of enemy civilians. During the civil rights era, the Klan sometimes switched to terrorism, bombing black churches and such, and a lot of radical groups from anarchists in the 1930s to Marxists in the 1970s would attack random police or bankers or other people they saw as members of the enemy class. Now, like I said, this doesn't exhaust things, these categories. We can and will define other types as we go along. For instance, we'll talk about types of reciprocal violence like feuding and raiding, and maybe even some more severe examples of unilateral violence like revolution and genocide. But this is a good start for us, these four types: lynching, rioting, terrorism, and vigilantism. This will get us pretty far along in learning how to talk about different forms of violence and explain why they erupt. In terms of why you get these different forms of violence, here again, we see the impact of social distance and status inequality on the nature of moralistic violence. So Senechal de la Roche, building on Black's theories, proposes that not only does increasing distance and inequality make each of these forms more likely than not, it makes them more likely than some lesser and nonviolent reaction, it also makes the forms with collective liability more likely than the forms with individual liability. You look at the history of lynch mobs versus riots, and you see lynchings are more of a rural thing, while riots are more of an urban thing. Senechal de la Roche explains this with the greater social ties and intimacy in the rural community or small town. Cities have more people who are strangers to one another. This results in the city mob being less inclined to make those kinds of exceptions. No, don't lynch Hank. He's one of the good ones. Or no, don't lynch him. He works for me and I need him to work for me. I've got the harvest coming due. So urban mobs are a little bit less concerned about who is guilty and who is one of the good ones, or who is valuable and who should be spared, and more likely to try to burn down the entire neighborhood of the alleged wrongdoers. Another factor that affects the kind of violence we're talking about is whether it is a chronic conflict or a more limited one. You can have a situation where you have a fairly peaceful town and suddenly there is a murder or alleged rape and an angry mob forms to avenge it. Or you can have something like an epidemic of killing or theft or rape. Maybe there's bands of robbers or other criminals who are striking again and again. This chronic or continuing deviance is more likely to provoke an organized response, a group that persists over time and handles many separate offenses. So chronic deviance is more likely to result in either vigilantism or terrorism, and greater social distance means you're more likely to get either terrorism or rioting rather than vigilantism or lynching. Sometimes the nature of intergroup relations can create chronic grievances. Group A invades and occupies the territory of Group B. People in Group B now have a daily source of standing grievances, a chronic conflict that might continue as long as Group A has power over them. This often breeds terrorism. Relations between cops and citizens in the black ghettos have a similar quality, and that helps explain some of the organized campaigns of assassination against the police that broke out in the 1970s. So to recap, as social distance increases, you're more likely to get mob violence. And even within mob violence that has individual liability tends to cluster in conflicts with relatively less distance than those that involve collective liability. Meanwhile, chronic conflicts tend to involve more organized and ongoing mob violence than fleeting or temporary conflicts. So in this episode, what we've done is we've introduced some very basic terms and concepts for describing collective violence and for describing the social environment in which it occurs. And we've put forth a few very basic, broad ideas about how that social environment shapes the violence. Moving on, what we're going to do is practice applying these concepts and principles to some examples. And we'll start our exploration of violence in American history by mapping out the social structure of past America. The past is a foreign country, and it's one where social divisions we might take for granted nowadays were either bigger or smaller than they are now. And understanding that is part of what's important to understanding America's history of collective violence.